In the late 1950s, John Freeman and Hugh Burnett created a popular interview program called Face to Face. In 1959, the production team traveled to Switzerland to interview Carl Jung at his home. That interview was broadcast on the BBC on October 22nd of that year. The program was met with an immediate public response. Many articles and letters to the editor were published, mostly positive but some negative and derogatory. The face-to-face program which follows this intro has a runtime of 38 minutes and 5 seconds, after which are some readings of some of the articles and letters to the editor, as well as some of the letters that Jung wrote in response. Jung wrote to Mr. Valentine Brooke. Mr. Brooke had written to Jung less than 1 month after the broadcast and included several of the clippings. Jung also replied to producer Hugh Burnett on Mr. Burnett's invitation to Jung for a follow-up interview.
Switzerland. Carl Gustav Jung, born in 1875. With Freud, one of the founding fathers of modern psychology. Still working at 84, he is the most honored living psychiatrist, and history will record him as one of the greatest physicians of all time.
Professor Jung, how many years have you lived in this lovely house by the lake at Zurich?
It's just about 50 years.
Do you live here now just with your secretaries and your English housekeeper?
Yes.
No children or grandchildren with you?
Oh, no, they don't live here, but I have plenty of them in the surroundings.
Do they come to see you often?
Oh, yes.
How many grandchildren have you?
Oh, 19.
And great-grandchildren?
I think 8, and I suppose one is on the way.
And do you enjoy having them?
Well, of course it's nice to feel such a living crowd around oneself.
Are they afraid of you, do you think?
I don't think so. If you would know my grandchildren, you wouldn't think so.
What?
They steal my things. Even my hat that belongs to me, they stole the other day.
Now, can I take you back to your own childhood? Do you remember the occasion when you first felt consciousness of your own individual self?
That was in my 11th year. There I suddenly, on my way to school, I stepped out of a mist. It was just as if I had been in a mist, walking in a mist, and I stepped out of it, and I knew I am. I am what I am. And then I thought, but what have I been before? And then I found that I had been in a mist, not knowing to differentiate myself from things. I was just one thing among many things.
Now, was that associated with any particular episode in your life, or was it just a normal function of adolescence?
Well, that's difficult to say. As far as I can remember, nothing had happened before that would explain this sudden coming to consciousness.
You hadn't, for instance, been quarrelling with your parents or anything?
No.
What memories have you of your parents? Were they strict and old-fashioned in the way they brought you up?
Oh, well, you know, they belonged to the later parts of the Middle Ages. And my father was a parson in the country, and you can imagine what people were then, you know, in the 70s of the past century. They had the convictions in which people have lived since 1,800 years.
How did he try to impress these convictions on you? Did he punish you, for instance?
Oh, no, not at all. No, he was very liberal, and he was most tolerant, most understanding.
Which did you get on with more intimately, your father or your mother?
That's difficult to say. Of course, one is always more intimate with the mother. But when it comes to the personal feeling, I had a better relation to my father, who was predictable, than with my mother, who was, to me, a very problematical something.
So, at any rate, fear was not an element in your relation with your father?
Not at all.
Did you accept him as being infallible in his judgments?
Oh, no, I knew he was very fallible.
How old were you when you knew that?
Now, let me see. Perhaps 11 or 12 years old. It was hanging together with the fact that I knew I was. And from then on, I saw that my father is different.
Yes. So the moment of self-revelation was closely connected with realizing the fallibility of your parents.
Yes, one could say so.
Now, what about...
But I realized that I had fear of my mother, but not during the day. There she was quite known to me and predictable, but in the night, I had fear of my mother.
And can you remember why? Can you remember what that
I have not the slightest idea why.
No. What about your school days now? Were you happy at school as a schoolboy?
In the beginning, I was very happy to have companions, you know, because before I had been very lonely. We lived in the country, and I had no brother and no sister. My sister was born very much later, when I was 9 years old. And so I was used to be alone, but I missed it. I missed company. And in school it was wonderful to have company. But soon, you know, in a country school, naturally, I was far ahead. And then I began to be bored.
What sort of religious upbringing did your father give you?
Oh, we were Swiss Reformed.
And did he make you attend church regularly?
Oh, well, that was quite natural. Yes. Everybody went to church on Sunday.
And did you believe in God?
Oh, yes.
Do you now believe in God?
Now? Difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe. I know.
Well, now, turning to the next staging point in your life, what made you decide to become a doctor?
That was in the first place a merely opportunistic choice. Originally, I wanted to be an archaeologist, Assyriology, Egyptology, or something of the sort. I hadn't the money. The study was too expensive. So my second love then belonged to nature, particularly zoology. And when I began my studies, I inscribed in the so-called philosophical faculty too. That means natural sciences. But then I soon saw that the career that was before me would make a schoolmaster of me. I never thought I had any chance to get any further because we had no money at all. And then I saw that didn't suit my expectations. You know, I didn't want to become a schoolmaster. Teaching was not just what I was looking for. And so I remember that my grandfather has been a doctor, and I knew that when I was studying medicine, I had a chance to study natural science and to become a doctor. And a doctor can develop. You see, he can have a practice. He can do. He can choose his scientific interests more or less. At all events, I would have more chance than being a schoolmaster. Also, the idea of doing something useful with human beings appealed to me.
And did you, when you decided to become a doctor, have difficulty in getting the training at school and in passing the exams?
I particularly had a difficulty with certain teachers that didn't believe that I could write a decent thesis. I remember one case where the teacher had the habit to discuss the papers written by the pupils, and he took the best first, and he went through the whole number of the pupils, and I didn't appear, and I was badly troubled over it, and I thought, well, it is impossible that my thesis can be that bad. And when he had finished, he said, there is still one paper left over, and that is the one by Jung. That would be by far the best paper if it hadn't been copied. He has just copied it somewhere, stolen. You are a thief, Jung. And if I knew where you have stolen it, I would fling you out of school. And I got mad, and I said, this is the one thesis where I have worked the most, because the theme was interesting, in contradistinction, you know, to other themes which are not at all interesting to me. And then he said, you are a liar, and if you can prove that you have stolen that thing somewhere, then you get out of school. Now that was a very serious thing to me, because what else then? You see, and I hated that fellow, and that was the only man I could have killed, you know. If I had met him once at a dark corner, I would have shown him something of what I could do.
Did you often have violent thoughts about people when you were young?
No, not exactly. Only when I got mad. Well, then I beat them up.
And did you often get mad?
Not so often, but then for good.
You were very strong and big, I imagine.
Yes, I was pretty strong. And you know, reared in the country with those peasant boys, it was a rough kind of life. And I would have been capable of violence, I know. I was a bit afraid of it. So I rather tried to avoid critical situations because I didn't trust myself. Once I was attacked by about 7 boys, and I got mad, and I took one and just swung him round with his legs, you know, and beat down 4 of them, and then they were satisfied.
And were there any consequences from that afterwards?
Oh, I should say yes. From then on, I was always suspected that I was at the bottom of every trouble. I was not, but they were afraid, and I was never attacked again.
Well, now, when the time came that you qualified as a doctor, what made you decide to specialize in being an alienist?
Yeah, that is rather an interesting point. When I had finished my studies practically, and when I didn't know what I really wanted to do, I had a big chance to follow one of my professors. He was called to a new position in Munich, and he wanted me as his assistant. But then, in that moment, I studied for my final examination. I came across the textbook, a textbook of psychiatry. Up to then, I thought nothing about it, because our professor then wasn't particularly interesting. And I only read the introduction to that book, where certain things were said about psychosis as a maladjustment of personality. That hit the nail on the head. In that moment, I saw I must become an alienist. My heart was thumping wildly in that moment. When I told my professor I wouldn't follow him, I would study psychiatry, he couldn't understand it. Nor my friends, because in those days psychiatry was nothing at all. But I saw one great chance to unite certain contrasting things in myself, namely, beside medicine, beside natural science, I always had studied history of philosophy and such subjects. It was just as if suddenly two streams were joining.
And how long was it after you took that decision that you first came in contact with Freud?
Oh, you know, that was at the end of my studies, and then it took quite a while until I met Freud. You see, I finished my studies in 1900, and I met Freud only very much later. I read, in 1900 I already read his dream interpretation and Freud studies about hysteria, but that was merely literary, you know. And then in 1907 I became acquainted with him personally.
Will you tell me how that happened? Did you go to Vienna?
Oh, well, I'd written a book about the psychology of dementia precox, that one called Schizophrenia then. And I sent him that book, and thus we became acquainted. I went to Vienna for a fortnight then, and then we had very long and penetrating conversations. And that settled it.
And this long and penetrating conversation was followed by personal friendship?
Oh, yes. It soon developed into a personal friendship.
And what sort of man was Freud?
Well, he was a complicated nature, you know. I liked him very much. But I soon discovered that when he had thought something, then it was settled, while I was doubting all along the line. And it was impossible to discuss something really à fond. You know, he had no philosophical education, particularly, you see, I was studying Kant, and I was steeped in it, and that was far from Freud. So from the very beginning, there was a discrepancy.
Did you in fact grow apart later, partly because of a difference in temperamental approach to experiment and proof and so on?
Well, of course, there is always a temperamental difference. And his approach was naturally different from mine, because his personality was different from mine. That led me into my later investigation of psychological types. There are definite attitudes. Some people are doing it in this way, and other people are doing it in another typical way. And there were such differences between myself and Freud, too.
Do you consider that Freud's standard of proof and experimentation was less high than your own?
Well, you see, that is an evaluation I'm not competent of. I am not my own history or my historiographer. With reference to certain results, I think my method has its merits.
Tell me, did Freud himself ever analyze you?
Oh yes, I submitted quite a lot of my dreams to him, and so did he.
And he to you, yes?
Oh yes,
yes.
Yes.
Do you remember now, at this distance of time, what were the significant features of Freud's dreams that you noted at the time?
Well, that is rather indiscreet to ask. You know, there is such a thing as a professional secret.
He's been dead these many years.
Yes, but these regards last longer than life. I prefer not to talk about it.
Well, may I ask you something else then, which perhaps is also indiscreet? Is it true that you have a very large number of letters which you exchanged with Freud, which are still unpublished?
Yes.
When are they going to be published?
Well, not during my lifetime.
You would have no objection to them being published after your lifetime?
Oh, no, not at all.
Because they are probably of great historical importance.
I don't think so.
Then why have you not published them so far?
Because they were not important to me enough. I see no particular importance in them.
They are concerned with personal matters?
Well, partially. But I wouldn't care to publish them.
Well, now, can we move on to the time when you did eventually part company with Freud? It was partly, I think, with the publication of your book, The Psychology of the Unconscious. Is that correct?
That was the real cause.
Well, now, before you...
Oh, I mean the final cause, because it had a long preparation. You know, from the beginning, I had a reservatio mentalis. I couldn't agree with quite a number of his ideas.
Which ones in particular?
Well, chiefly his purely personal approach and his disregard of the historical conditions of man. You see, we depend largely upon our history. We are shaped through education, through the influence of the parents, which are by no means always personal. They were prejudiced or they were influenced by historical ideas or what I call dominance. And that is a most decisive factor in psychology. And we are not of today or of yesterday. We are of an immense age.
Was it not partly your observation, your clinical observation of psychotic cases, which led you to differ from Freud on this?
It was partially my experience with schizophrenic patients that led me to the idea of certain general historical conditions.
Is there any one case that you can now look back on and feel that perhaps it was the turning point of your thought?
Oh, yes. I made quite a number of experiences of that sort, and I went even to Washington to study Negroes at the psychiatric clinic there in order to find out whether they have the same type of dreams as we have. And these experiences and others led me then to the hypothesis that there is an impersonal stratum in our psyche. And I can tell you an example. We had a patient in the ward. He was quiet but completely dissociated, schizophrenic. And he was in the clinic already for over 20 years. He had come into the clinic, as a matter of fact, being a young man, a little clerk. and did no particular education. And once I came to the warm, and he was obviously excited and called to me, took me by the lapel of my coat and led me to the window and said, "Doctor, now you must see. Now look at it. Look up at the sun and see how it moves. You see, you must move your head too, like this, and then you will see the follows of the sun. And, that's the origin of the wind. And you see how the sun moves as you move your head from one side to the other." Now, of course, I didn't understand it at all. I thought, there you are, he's just crazy. But that case remained in my mind. And 4 years later, I came across a paper written by the German historian Dietrich, who had dealt with the so-called Mithras liturgy, a part of the great Parisian sorcerer papyrus. And there he produced a part of the so-called Mithras liturgy. Namely, it is said there, after the second prayer, thou wilt see how the disk of the sun unfolds. And you will see hanging down from it the tube, the origin of the wind. And when you move thy face to the regions of the east, it will move there. And if you move your face to the region of the west, it will follow you. And instantly, I knew, now this is it. This is the vision of my patient.
But how could you be sure that your patient wasn't unconsciously recalling something that somebody had told him?
Oh, no, quite out of question, because that thing was not known. It was in a magic papyrus in Paris, and it wasn't even published. It was only published 4 years later after I had observed it with my patient.
And this you felt proved that there was an unconscious which was something more than personal.
Oh, well, that was not a proof to me, but it was a hint. And I took the hint.
Yes. Now, tell me, how did you first decide to start your work on the psychological types? Was that also as a result of some particular clinical experience?
Less so. It was a very personal reason. Namely, to do justice to the psychology of Freud, also to that of Adler, and to find my own bearings. That helped me to understand why Freud developed such a theory, or why Adler developed his theory, his power principle.
Have you concluded what psychological type you are yourself?
Naturally, I have devoted a great deal of attention to that painful question,
And reached a conclusion?
Well, you see, the type is nothing static. It changes in the course of life. But I most certainly was characterized by thinking. I always thought, from early childhood on. And I had a great deal of intuition too. And I had a definite difficulty with feeling. And my relation to reality was not particularly brilliant. I was often at variance with the reality of things. Now that gives you all the necessary data for the diagnosis.
During the 1930s, when you were working a lot with German patients, you did, I believe, forecast that a Second World War was very likely. Well, now, looking at the world today, do you feel that a Third World War is likely?
I have no definite indications in that respect. But there are so many indications that one doesn't know what one sees. Is it trees or is it the wood? It's very difficult to say. because the dreams of people's dreams contain apprehensions, you know. But it is very difficult to say whether they point to a war, because that idea is uppermost in people's mind. Formerly, you know, it has been much simpler. People didn't think of a war. And therefore, it was rather clear what the dreams meant. Nowadays, no more so. We are so full of apprehensions, fears, that one doesn't know exactly to what it points. But one thing is sure, a great change of our psychological attitude is imminent. That is certain.
Why?
Because we need more. We need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger, and we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied, because we are the origin of all coming evil.
Well, does man, do you think, need to have the concept of sin and evil to live with? Is this part of our nature?
Well, obviously.
And of a redeemer?
That is an inevitable consequence.
This is not a concept which will disappear as we become more rational. It's something which
Well, I don't believe that man ever will deviate from the original pattern of his being. There will always be such ideas. For instance, if you do not directly believe in a personal redeemer, as it was the case with Hitler, or the hero worship in Russia, then it is an idea. It is a symbolic idea.
You have written at one time and another some sentences which have surprised me a little about death. Now, in particular, I remember you said that death is psychologically just as important as birth, and like it, it's an integral part of life. But surely it can't be like birth if it's an end, can it?
Yes, if it's an end. And there we are not quite certain about this end. Because, you know, there are these peculiar faculties of the psyche, that it isn't entirely confined to space and time. You can have dreams or visions of the future. You can see round corners and such things. Only ignorance deny these facts. It's quite evident that they do exist and have existed always. Now, these facts show that the psyche, in part at least, is not dependent upon these confinements. And then what? When the psyche is not under that obligation to live in time and space alone, and obviously it doesn't, then to that extent the psyche is not submitted to those laws. And that means a practical continuation of life, of a sort of psychical existence beyond time and space.
Do you yourself believe that death is probably the end, or do you believe that...
Well, I can't say. You see, the word belief is a difficult thing for me. I don't believe. I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis. Either I know a thing, and when I know it, I don't need to believe it. If I don't allow myself, for instance, to believe a thing just for the sake of believing it. I can't believe it. But when there are sufficient reasons for a certain hypothesis, I shall accept these reasons, naturally, and should say, we have to reckon with the possibility of so-and-so, you know.
Well, now, you've told us that we should regard death as being a goal,
yes,
and that to shrink away from it is to evade life and
yes,
make life purposeless.
yes.
What advice would you give to people in their later life to enable them to do this, when most of them must in fact believe that death is the end of everything?
Well, you see, I have treated many old people, and it's quite interesting to watch what the unconscious is doing with the fact that it is apparently threatened with a complete end. It disregards it. Life behaves as if it were going on. And so I think it is better for old people to live on, to look forward to the next day, as if he had to spend centuries. And then he lives properly. But when he is afraid, when he doesn't look forward, he looks back, he petrifies, he gets stiff and he dies before his time. But when he is living on, looking forward to the great adventure that is ahead, then he lives. And that is about what the unconscious is intending to do. Of course, it's quite obvious that we are all going to die, and this is the sad finale of everything. But nevertheless, there is something in us that doesn't believe it, apparently. But this is merely a fact, a psychological fact. Doesn't mean to me that it proves something. It is simply so. For instance, I may not know why we need salt, but we prefer to eat salt too, because you feel better. And so when you think in a certain way, you may feel considerably better. And I think if you think along the lines of nature, then you think properly.
And this leads me to the last question that I want to ask you. As the world becomes more technically efficient, it seems increasingly necessary for people to behave communally and collectively. Now, do you think it possible that the highest development of man may be to submerge his own individuality in a kind of collective consciousness?
That's hardly possible. I think there will be a reaction. A reaction will set in against this communal dissociation. You know, man doesn't stand forever his nullification. Once there will be a reaction. And I see it setting in. You know, when I think of my patients, they all seek their own existence, and to assure their existence against that complete atomization into nothingness or into meaninglessness. Man cannot stand a meaningless life.
Friday, October 23rd, 1959, from The Guardian. Face to Face with a Founding Father by our television critic. The interview with Professor Jung in Face to Face on the BBC last night was a thing of immense charm, but there was disappointingly little about Jung's work. Whether this was because John Freeman assumed that everyone knew about it, or whether, on the contrary, it was thought that viewers would not understand if it were discussed, we may never know. But it was odd to interview so famous a man, a founding father of modern psychology, and to spend so little time on asking about the fundamentals of his life work. The interview took place in his house at Zurich after a glimpse of the lake and garden. It began with conversation about his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, his own childhood, parents, and his school days. He became excited and vehement in talking about the schoolmaster who had said, when Jung had written an excellent thesis, that he must have copied it because it was so good. "I could have killed him if I had met him in a dark corner," declared Jung. "When I get mad for good." Then came the choice of a career. Jung would have been an archaeologist had he had the money. But in choosing to be a doctor, he found the work he loved. On Freud, he was not tremendously forthcoming. Freud had no philosophic education, whereas he himself was steeped in Kant. They had submitted their dreams to each other for analysis, but he would not talk about Freud's dreams, nor was he to be drawn on the letters they exchanged, which will not be published in his lifetime. There is an error in this article print. Towards the end of the interview, Jung discussed topics about the psyche, space and time, the collective unconscious, and belief and death. There is something in us that refuses to think of death as the end, and man cannot stand a meaningless life were among his sayings. At the end, one felt that it was time for the beginning. The interview had passed quickly and easily, like an introduction to Jung, and just as it got down to the essentials, it was over. Friday, October 23rd, from the Daily Herald. TV last night. The Professor Made Us Think, by Phil Diack. The BBC invited us to put on our thinking caps last night at a time when we are normally yawning and reaching for our nightcaps. What a privilege it was to go to a delightful lakeside home in Switzerland and hear Professor Jung talking about his life and work as a psychologist and expounding his views on the plight of mankind. It was another of John Freeman's masterly face-to-face interviews. Though looking a benevolent old man, he soon made it clear that he was very tough indeed. He was sharply reticent about his differences with Freud and flatly refused to give any details of Freud's dreams. Jung's work among Germans in the 1930s led him to predict the Second World War. To Freeman, he would make no prophecy about a Third World War. But there was a great urgency in his reminder. The only real danger that exists is man himself. We are the origin of all coming evil. After this came the Brains Trust in its new late-night spot, and there was a rare sense of continuity when it discussed one of Jung's remarks. Men cannot stand a meaningless life. Sunday, October 25th, from the London Observer. Television. Buridan's Ass's Night, by Maurice Richardson. Thursday night, which used to have as low a viewing IQ as any, has suddenly become an intellectual's feast. There was enough mental pablum on both channels to make us autodidacts nod from one to the other like Buridan's ass. Only partly responsible was the transferred Brains Trust, a troika now with the QM joining in and making it more of a discussion. An improvement, I think. Bullock, Blackett, and Bronowski all seemed relaxed and at ease, as if they were in the Athenaeum rather than a BBC hospitality room. We got some interesting general gas ranging from the meaning of meaninglessness to mathematical infinity, also an exciting line on the coal crisis. I hope they will be able to keep up this cerebral standard and not give us too many illustrious cauliflowers. I don't mind an occasional commonsensical pipe from Prince Bira, but I have yet to learn anything at all from Princess Ileana. Their first question had been suggested by Freeman's teleprofile of Jung in Face to Face. They seemed as uncertain as I was just what the 84-year-old Swiss sage did believe. Brilliantly photographed, he made an impression of marvelous health, some charm, and much fuzziness, like an old mystical major general. Almost the only time he committed himself was when he said the human psyche existed outside space and time, and we could see round corners. I should much like to think this were so, but without evidence must remain one of the ignorant unconvinced. Freeman handled him with diffident respect and not one awkward question. But they got their wires crossed on the role of Hitler as Redeemer. The Freud situation was skated over. Sunday, November 1st, from The Observer, by Maurice Richardson. Home imitators. Hypnotism is always good visual value. Lifeline's demonstration last Tuesday was satisfactorily dramatic. The subjects all went through their paces perfectly, showing that morbid total dependence which is the feature of the hypnotic rapport. I am sure the hypnotist's tone of absolute confidence and his very quiet fast patter will have imitators in several thousand family circles. One of the star turns, the lady who regressed to the age of 11, and the air raids of Purley with Germans coming down by parachute, may have sounded a bit histrionic, but hypnotic subjects are apt to do that. Any attempt to hypnotize the mass TV audience must, I suppose, remain strictly verboten. What they might give us, though, is an experiment to see if there is anything in the method by which the monks of Mount Athos are alleged to have been winning football pools. They hypnotize each other into thinking that it is Sunday morning, and they are reading the results. If, as Jung maintains, the unconscious is not subject to the ordinary laws of time and space, it might work. Tonight ought to be able to test it out for us with a hypnotist, a few studio volunteers, and some hurdle races. Should the hypnotized psyche turn out to be precognitive, Mr. Butler's proposed gambling shops will witness stormy scenes. From Sunday, November 1, The Observer, Letters to the Editor. Jung on TV. Sir, criticizing Jung's replies in the BBC's TV interview, Face to Face, on October 22nd, Maurice Richardson observes, almost the only time he committed himself was when he said the human psyche existed outside space and time and we could see round corners. In fact, he committed himself on two more accounts: certain knowledge, beyond mere belief, of the existence of God, and conviction that all evil comes from man. As to the third assertion, already stated, those of us who have had dreams and later come upon them in what we arbitrarily call the future know that Jung is right when he affirms that the psyche is not limited by time and space. Mr. Richardson remains one of the ignorant and unconvinced, only because he has not had this particular experience, an experience which can be proved by the witness of others. Phoebe, Hesketh. Sunday, November 8th, The Observer. Letters to the Editor. Jung on TV. Sir, Ms. Hesketh says that in his TV interview in Face to Face on October 22nd, Jung committed himself on 2 points: certain knowledge, beyond mere belief, of the existence of God, and conviction that all evil comes from man. This is somewhat misleading on both counts. To the question, "Do you believe in God?" Jung replied after a long pause, "It is difficult to say, but I don't need to believe, I know." But when Jung says that he knows God exists, all he really means is that he knows that the idea of God exists, or in his own terminology, the belief in God is a psychic fact. In Jung's system, every widely held belief is a psychic fact, whether or not it corresponds to any objective reality. As he explains in Answer to Job, page XI, quote, if, for example, a general belief exists that the river Rhine has at one time flowed backwards from its mouth to its source, then this belief would itself be a fact, even though such an assertion, physically understood, would sound utterly incredible. Beliefs of this kind are psychic facts which cannot be contested and need no proof. Religious statements are of this type. Unquote. In an earlier book, Psychological Types, Jung wrote on pages 300 and 301, quote, God is a function of the unconscious. The divine effect springs from one's own inner self, unquote. If this view is accepted, it follows inevitably that all evil comes ultimately from man. But in making this assertion, Jung was not, as Miss Hesketh appears to think, expressing the orthodox Christian belief in an all-good God. On the contrary, he has poured scorn on this view. Quote, to believe that God is the summum bonum is impossible for a reflecting consciousness. Unquote. Answer to Job, page 49. When Christians claim Jung as an ally, one is tempted to wonder which of his books they have read. Margaret Knight. Sunday, November 15th. The Observer, Letters to the Editor. Jung on TV. Sir, when Jung appeared on TV, his attitude was one of kindness and reserve. To certain questions he replied with a courteous ambiguity, which recalled Christ when interviewed on the matter of paying tribute to Caesar. Perhaps he suspected that the motive behind most journalism is less a disinterested love of truth than a desire to catch a public figure in an embarrassing position. As those familiar with his 12 volumes of his published work will know, Jung distinguishes between the task of the psychologist and that of the theologian. The psychologist studies the idea of God in human minds and the effect of such an idea on human conduct. It does not fall to his lot to speculate upon the cause of this idea, for the question of the objective reality of these ideas and of the relation between them and other facts in the universe belongs to the province of the philosopher or the theologian. It so happens that some Christian theologians find in Jung's discoveries facts which confirm them in their belief in the transforming effect of the Holy Communion service, in the sureness of Christ's insights into human behavior, and in the value of symbolic thinking. Nor do they consider these deductions invalidated by the fact that Jung does not worship at their altars. Reverend R.F. Dosseter, Chairman of the Guild of Pastoral Psychology. Miss Phoebe Hesketh replies, Sir, my letter in no way claimed Jung as a Christian, as Mrs. Knight's answer implies. It only pointed out that through the mist of non-committal, in itself non-Christian, he did come clear on 3 accounts. Knowledge of God, quote, as a function of the unconscious. The divine effect springs from one's own inner self, unquote. Not stated, but understood by his readers. Certainly that all evil comes from man, and thirdly that the psyche is unbound by time and space. These convictions, while asserting the limitless power of the unconscious, are obviously not confined to Orthodox Christianity. Jung's rejections put him right outside it. Phoebe Hesketh. Third letter to the editor by Bernard Campbell. Sir, in her letter last week, Margaret Knight is guilty of quoting part of an exposition out of context. She must read both paragraphs from which she quotes. Jung C.G. Answer to Job, page XI. Quote, this conflict, about religious belief, is due to the strange supposition that a thing is true only if it presents itself as a physical fact. Physical is not the only criterion for truth. There are also psychic truths, which can neither be explained nor proved nor contested in any physical way. Here follows the example about the Rhine flowing backwards. Religious statements are of this kind. They refer without exception to things which cannot be established as physical facts. If they do not do this, they would inevitably fall into the category of natural sciences. Unquote. Mrs. Knight is also guilty of interpreting Jung's remarks by a fallacious implication that since some psychic facts do not correspond to reality, all religious statements are false. Since the fact of God's existence is a level of reality which is not part of the narrow confines of natural science, a humanist will never accept this fact except by leaving the false security of a closed system of belief, and recognizing the existence of an awful reality which transcends the material world. Depth psychology is very suggestive of such a reality. Bernard Campbell. Now begin 4 letters written by Jung in response to the public response. Written first to Valentine Brooke and to Hugh Burnett, to one Mr. M. Leonard, and a second to Hugh Burnett. So in 1959, October 22nd, we have a fallout within a few days. Written in response to a letter received by Mr. Valentine Brooke. And this is original written in English on November 16th, so just under a month later. Dear Sir, as you have learned from Mr. Richardson's account, I am an irritating person. Note number 1. On October 22nd, the British Broadcasting Corporation broadcast a television interview with Jung conducted by John Freeman in the series Face to Face. In the course of the interview, Freeman asked, "Do you believe in God?" To which Jung answered after a long pause, "I don't need to believe, I know." These words gave rise to considerable argument, and Valentine Brooke sent Jung a rather derogatory review of the broadcast written by Maurice Richardson in the London Observer from 25th of October 1959, 3 days after the broadcast, as well as some of the correspondence published in the same paper about Jung's words. Mr. Brooke asked Jung for their exact meaning. The interview with Freeman is published in C.G. Jung Speaking. Now I got a copy of that. This contains a little bit like a header or like a little intro paragraph about Hugh Burnett and the production of that face-to-face documentary interview. Okay, so continuing. As you have learned from Mr. Richardson's account, I am an irritating person. I am dealing with doubts and views which puzzle the modern mind consciously as well as unconsciously. I am treading on corns, left and right. As a consequence, I have to spend a great amount of my time in handing out apologies and explanations for saying things which allude to facts and ideas unknown to the reader. Moreover, the reader is handicapped by his positivistic premise that the truth is simple and can be expressed in one short sentence. Yet nothing is quite true, and even this is not quite true, as Multatuli says. A psychologist concerned with the treatment of mental disturbances is constantly reminded of the fallacies in our verbal formulations. In spite of all the difficulties besetting my way, I will try to explain my standpoint. Whatever I perceive from without or within is a representation or image, a psychic entity caused, as I rightly or wrongly assume, by a corresponding real object. But I have to admit that my subjective image is only a grosso modo identical with the object. Any portrait painter will agree with this statement, and the physicist will add that what we call colors are really wavelengths. The difference between image and real object shows that the psyche, apperceiving an object, alters it by adding or excluding certain details. The image, therefore, is not entirely caused by the object. It is also influenced by certain pre-existent psychic conditions which we can correct only partially. We cannot remove color perception, for instance. Moreover, we know from experience that all acts of apperception are influenced by pre-existing patterns of perceiving objects. For instance, the premise of causality, particularly obvious in pathological cases, being exaggerations or distortions of so-called normal behavior. They are presuppositions pertaining to the whole of humanity. The history of the human mind offers no end of examples, for instance, folklore, fairy tales, religious symbolism, etc. To explain the spontaneous origin of such parallelisms, the theory of migration, note 2, is insufficient. I call them archetypes. An example, instinctual forms of mental functioning. They are not inherited ideas, but mentally expressed instincts, forms, and not contents. They influence our image formation. As experience shows, archetypes are equipped with a specific energy without which they could not have causal effects. Thus, when we try to form an image of the fact one calls God, we depend largely upon innate pre-existent ways of perceiving, all the more so as it is a perception from within, unaided by the observation of physical facts which might lend their visible forms to our God image, though there are plenty of cases of the sort. God, therefore, is in the first place a mental image equipped with instinctual numinosity. An example, an emotional value bestowing the characteristic autonomy of the effect on the image. This is my chief statement. Now, people unaccustomed to proper thinking assume that it is a final statement. No scientific statement is final. It is a likely formulation of observation and analysis. It goes as far as a scientific statement can go. But it does not and cannot say what God is. It only can define what He is in our mind. The mind is neither the world in itself, nor does it reproduce its accurate image. The fact that we have an image of the world does not mean that there is only an image and no world. But this is exactly the argument of those who assume that when I speak of the God image, I mean that God does not exist, as He is only an image. Our images are, as a rule, of something, and even delusions are images of something, as modern psychology has amply shown. If, for instance, I imagine an animal which does not exist in reality as we know it, I form the picture of a mythological entity following the age-old activity of our ancestors in imagining fairy beasts and doctor animals. I am functioning within the frame of an archetype. I am, in this case, strongly influenced by it. The archetype has efficacy. But although we can be fairly certain that no such animal exists in physical reality, there is nevertheless a real cause which has suggested the creation of the dragon. The dragon image is its expression. The God image is the expression of an underlying experience of something, which I cannot attain to by intellectual means, an example by scientific cognition, unless I commit an unwarrantable transgression. When I say that I don't need to believe in God because I know, I mean I know of the existence of God images in general and in particular. I know it is a matter of a universal experience, and in so far as I am no exception, I know that I have such experience also, which I call God. It is the experience of my will over against another, and very often stronger will, crossing my path, often with seemingly disastrous results, putting the strange ideas into my head and maneuvering my fate sometimes into most undesirable corners, or giving it unexpected favorable twists, outside my knowledge and my intention. The strange force against or for my conscious tendencies is well known to me. So I say, I know him. But why should you call this something God? I would ask, why not? It has always been called God. An excellent and very suitable name indeed. Who could say in earnest that his fate and life have been the result of his conscious planning alone? Have we had a complete picture of the world? Millions of conditions are in reality beyond our control. On innumerable occasions, our lives could have taken an entirely different turn. Individuals who believe they are masters of their fate are, as a rule, the slaves of destiny. A Hitler or Mussolini could believe they were such masterminds. Respice finem. I know what I want, but I am doubtful and hesitant whether the something is of the same opinion or not. Hoping I have succeeded in elucidating the puzzle. Sincerely yours, C.G. Jung. That was written just under a month after the broadcast. We now turn to a few days later, into early, from, what was it, November 16th to December 5th. Written to the producer of the documentary, Hugh Burnett. Dear Mr. Burnett, so many letters I have received have emphasized my statement about knowing God. About knowing. That I have written an answer to a man whose letter was particularly articulate in this respect. You will find a copy enclosed. I explained what my opinion is about a knowledge of God. I know it is an unconventional way of thinking, and I quite understand if it should suggest that I am no Christian. Yet I think of myself as a Christian. Since I am entirely based upon Christian concepts, I only try to escape their internal contradictions by introducing a more modest attitude which takes into consideration the immense darkness of the human mind. The Christian idea proves its vitality by a continuous evolution, just like Buddhism. Our time certainly demands some new thoughts in this respect, as we cannot continue to think in an antique or medieval way when we enter the sphere of religious experience. Thank you very much for the nice photos. It is good for one's self-education to see some undeniable evidence for the stupidity of facial expression. Yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. This is to M. Leonard, written the same day as his response to Mr. Hugh Burnett, which is commended by Jung as a very articulate letter. Now, in response, Jung writes, Dear Sir, and this is originally written in English, Mr. Freeman, in his characteristic manner, fired the question you allude to at me in a somewhat surprising way, so that I was perplexed and had to say the next thing which came into my mind. As soon as the answer had left the edge of my teeth, I knew I had said something controversial. Puzzling, or even ambiguous, oh yes. And I was therefore just waiting for letters like yours. Mind you, I didn't say, there is a God. I said, I don't need to believe in God, I know. Which does not mean I do know a certain God. Zeus, Yahweh, Allah, the Trinitarian God, etc. But rather, I do know that I am obviously confronted with a factor unknown in itself, which I call God, en consensu omnium, quod semper quodubique, quod ab omnibus creditur. Note what translates what is believed always, everywhere, and by everyone. I remember him, I evoke him. Whenever I use his name overcome by anger or by fear, whenever I involuntarily say, "Oh God." That happens when I meet somebody or something stronger than myself. It is an apt name given to all overpowering emotions in my own psychic system, subduing my conscious will and usurping control over myself. This is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions and change the course of my life for better or worse. In accordance with tradition, I call the power of fate, in this positive as well as a negative aspect, and inasmuch as its origin is beyond my control, God, a personal God, since my fate means very much myself, particularly when it approaches me in the form of a conscience as a vox Dei, with which I can even converse and argue. And we do, and at the same time we know that we do. One is subject as well as object. Yet I should consider it an intellectual immorality to indulge in the belief that my view of a God is the universal metaphysical being of the confessions or philosophies. I commit the impertinence neither of a hypostasis nor of an arrogant qualification such as God can only be good. Only my experience can be good or evil, but I know that the superior will is based upon a foundation which transcends human imagination. Since I know of my collision with a superior will in my own psychic system, I know of God. And if I should venture the illegitimate hypostasis of my image, I would say of a God beyond good and evil, just as much dwelling in myself as everywhere else. Deus est circulis cuius centrum est ubique, quius circumferentia vero nasquam. Hoping I have answered your question, I remain, dear sir, yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. Now, following this, in 1960, Carl Jung was invited or requested by Hugh Burnett to have another interview. Don't know if it was presumably with the face-to-face series as well. Jung was not feeling very well. 1960 June. Jung's letter in response to Mr. Burnett reads, "Dear Mr. Burnett, your letter and invitation have arrived at a moment when I find it hard to make up my mind at all. I am tired by the work of a whole year, and I could not envisage the possibility of further exertions. I don't want to say no, definitely, but I should like to postpone my answer to a time when I have had my due rest. My wish is that you would take up the problem once more in September, when I am more sure of my capacity again. Your quite understandable proposition to confront me with an interlocutor whom I do not know personally does not simplify the situation, as I am rather frightened of my colleagues on account of so many unfortunate experiences, i.e. unnecessary misunderstandings and prejudices. I will mention only a few of them. Archetypes are metaphysical ideas, are mystical, do not exist. I am a philosopher, have a father complex against Freud, and so on. It is unsatisfactory and fatiguing to deal with people who neither have read my books, nor have the slightest notion of the methods I am applying and their justification. I cannot deal any more with people who are unacquainted with the world of problems I am concerned with. I avoid as much as possible interviews with those of my colleagues who are in need of basic information. I also avoid people with an antagonistic attitude from the start, who only want to know their own ideas, but not mine. I consider a certain amount of open-mindedness as indispensable for an interview. I can explain my standpoint, but I refuse to fight uphill. Such gladiator games are good for so-called scientific congresses, but are the worst obstacle for real understanding. I have no patience anymore with sheer ignorance. If you are sure your man is open-minded, fair, and willing to weigh my argument objectively and capable of doing so, I can look forward more easily to such an interview. I must ask for your forgiveness for these measures of precaution because my old age has left me with a sorry remnant of my former energies. I cannot explain and fight at the same time against ignorance and incompetence. I have, for the sake of my health, to ask my partner first. Have you read a book I have written within the last 30 years? And did you understand it? If not, I shut up. I am sick of talking to people who do not even know the psychological ABC. There are so many people who either designate themselves as my pupils or aver that they know my system that I am always a bit scared when I have to meet an unknown person. I trust you are aware of this serious question. The whole interview depends on it. A few years ago, university got an interview out of me, to which they sent a professor of psychology who was completely ignorant and to whom one could not talk intelligently. I had then been still strong enough to push him aside and give a free talk about some basic aspects. I could not do that anymore. At all events, I should be much obliged to you if you would give me the chance to see my psychiatric partner before we start, so that I can get an idea of the level on which a talk would be possible. My apologies for my hesitations and anxieties. I remain yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. Written June 30th, 1960. And approximately 1 year later, June 6th, he had just finished the last writing of his life, which was the contribution into it's the Approaching the Unconscious, which went into The Man and His Symbols late May, early June, and on June 6, 1961, he passed away. And so we have a nice legacy of his writings and letters and books, and I heartily recommend anybody to buy his books. So like I got like his 2 volumes of books and C.G. Jung speaking, and I over the course of like 4 years I collected his entire collected works. I really recommend people getting into Jung's writings. If you made it this far, I really appreciate it, and thank you very much for listening.